Companies, organizations that want to get back to gender equity, start with your entry level, keep track of that data all the way up, and we could fix this problem pretty soon. Those of us who are not in leadership can also do something by listening for, being aware of the person who's being overlooked in the meeting, the person who's being interrupted. Women are interrupted 3 times more frequently than men, and calling it out.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Learning from Leaders series. Joined, as always, by my good friend Peter Vanham on the other side of Lake Geneva. Good afternoon, Peter. Hope you're doing well.
Hey, look, good to see you.
Great to see you too. And today we have the great pleasure to welcome Joanne Lipman, the former editor-in-chief of USA Today and the author of That's What She Said. This is still part of our Women's in Business months. So I hope we're going to have a great talk. Floor is all yours, Peter.
That's great. Thanks so much. Look, I wish I could be there with you, but of course we're facing a little bit of a third wave, I'm afraid, in terms of COVID. That is still with us. But perhaps today we can forget a little bit all about that. And at least we'll be having the honor to speak to Joanne Lipman. You already said it. Joanne is the former editor-in-chief of USA Today. She's a best-selling, New York Times best-selling author of the book, That's What She Said. By the way, many of you are going to be receiving that book. And she's also a regular contributor to various American news channels, including CNBC. But I think actually all the other ones too. Joanne, you'll tell us all about that in just a second. And you know, we want to learn a lot from you, of course, Joanne, about we're in the Women's Month at EU Business School. We want to talk to you at length about that. But first, as we always do, we want to know how you are and where you are.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I do wish I could be with you in person. Instead, I'm here in New York, where it's rainy and disgusting, and I wish I were in the south of France with some of you. I'm fine, actually. Thank you for asking, Peter. We are locked down here as well, but they're doing a little bit better now with the vaccine, so we hope to be out and about within a month or so, perhaps. Fingers crossed. So far, so good. Thank you.
That's great. And I don't know if that's a personal question, whether people are actually asking that and sharing that with each other. But have you had the vaccine, or are you looking forward to getting it? How's that?
I get part 2 tomorrow, which is so exciting. So exciting.
Oh, wow.
They had a lot of restrictions early on, and just in the last month or so, they've opened it up to, so most people who want to get it can get it at this point. It depends state by state. But yeah, so things are looking up. There's some concerns, obviously, in the United States. We've got some of the states that have done away with all of their restrictions, which is a concern. And then, of course, we have the UK variant, some of these other variants that are emerging. So, you know, it's a little bit of a cautious optimism, I would say.
Yeah, and what a roller coaster it has been. It was almost a year ago, I think, to the day that the lockdown started, at least here in Geneva and in many parts of Europe, and then a little later in the US. And for a long time, it seemed like the US was always a little bit behind on Europe, at least when it came to the first wave, the second wave. And frankly, for a long time, the news made it appear as though things were going horrible in the US, just as they were bad in Europe. Today, the news seems to be much better. To what do you attribute this? Do you attribute this to the vaccines? Is it that the better leadership? What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, the changing leadership has made an enormous difference because, you know, we had a vaccine denier in the White House, though he did take the vaccine, but we had a COVID denier essentially in the White House. And Biden, under President Biden, who came in on January 20th, this has been his first most important aggressive move has been to try and speed up vaccination delivery. And you can see the impact. That said, I have to say the fact that we have the vaccine is due to the efforts that were done by the pharmaceutical companies in the last year. So I think it's due to the Biden administration that the delivery has been accelerated.
Yeah, it's really remarkable, isn't it, to see that change all of a sudden, I suppose, in how people look forward to the future. Seem to be a lot more optimism, at least in the US, because I have to say, I'm afraid here in Europe, things aren't looking so great. So I don't want to linger on that too much, but one of the other things that I also found very interesting that you may have an opinion on is this sort of rise in all kinds of conspiracy theories that we've seen in the past year. And we talked already a little bit in preparation about where that may come from here in Europe. These long lockdowns that seem to last forever. The vaccine rollout that's not going so well. How is that in the US? Are people mentally getting healthier as well, or do we still see a proliferation of these conspiracy theories?
Yeah, I think the mental health fallout from COVID is just starting, and we see it, I think, in part because of the conspiracy theories are part of, right, the fact that people are isolated. It leads to conspiracy theorizing, it leads to paranoia, it leads to people spending way too much time on their devices. And unfortunately, the way that our social media in particular is set up, what they're looking for is to keep you engaged. And we know from the research that what keeps you engaged is information that incites anger and incites fear. And we also know that false information travels multiple times quicker than true information. I was on it was called the Knight Commission on Trust and Democracy in Media, and we delved into this. And it's really quite frightening to see that the way the social media companies are set up, they incentivize us to dig down into this kind of false, frightening, anger-inducing information. And because people are at home and they're spending more time and they're isolated, it's really aggravated all that. Plus, as you said, the mental health fallout is going to be tremendous. We have a lot of, as I'm sure you do in Europe, a lot of people talking about burnout and about depression and anxiety levels that have risen up to historic highs. And we will be dealing with that for a number of years, I have no doubt.
Yeah, I have two follow-up questions for you, Joanne. One, because you spent your whole career so far in the media, and you've led for many years a newspaper, USA Today, that was really a middle of the road newspaper, you could say, like the only national newspaper almost that didn't have a political color. So on the other hand, you have also seen the rise of like partisan journalism, politically driven journalism over the years, I suppose, over the decades, and particularly the last few years. So you mentioned that social media were a big culprit for you. Is there a problem with mainstream media as well?
Yeah, you are correct that the mainstream media, it used to be, if you go back a few decades, 20, 30 years, it was a much more balanced diet of media, and it has become more and more partisan. And I do think it becomes an issue when, and it was made more of an issue under President Trump, who tried to make the media the enemy, which I've now been reading books on autocracy, which apparently is an autocratic strategy used throughout history, is to make the media the enemy. And I think that that's really hurt, because what we want to do is full, fair reporting and put a spotlight on power and hold power to account, regardless of which political party is in power. But by painting the media as the enemy of the people, what that's done is put the media in a defensive crouch, and you end up with some of your big mainstream news organizations appearing to take on the mantle of being the opposition instead of just being reporters who are there to shed light. They have been painted, and in some cases, they have internalized being the opposition. I'm hopeful that will, we have an administration now that is not demonizing the media. So I'm hopeful that we will get back to a place where we can all agree on what is a fact. But it's hard to put that toothpaste back in the tube, as they say.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? Because I was having a conversation the other day with a couple of other editors that I'm sure places like Reuters, Washington Post, and including also with the former head of Operation Warp Speed, the agency or the commission that sort of led this vaccine effort in the US that has been very successful. And the head of that operation said, well, I feel unfairly treated because, I'm not partisan. And if I am partisan, I'm actually not aligned politically with the Trump administration, but I served under him and we were very successful. And I feel like I didn't get the right credit for that precisely because of that really partisan, you say, like the oppositional kind of journalism. So, it can be hoped then also that we get out of that in the years to come, I suppose.
Well, one of the issues that I think is really important with the media is there's been a lot of cuts because of all of the financial issues that you've heard about with the media. Advertising drying up, people moving to digital, the media, the news media being too slow, legacy news media, to kind of understand those changes. Part of the problem with the cuts has been that the media, which was always really focused and most consolidated on the two coasts, on the East and West Coast, the New York and Los Angeles coasts, is even more so now. So the organizations, the media organizations that are stronger are on those two coasts. They have fewer people in the middle of the country, and then local news organizations in the middle of the country have been decimated. They've just been gutted with cuts. And what that means is that we have media that is really not reflective of the entire country or even understanding the entire country. And that becomes an enormous issue as well, because people in the middle of the country are feeling that they're being overlooked. And in fact, in many cases, they are being overlooked. And we have to do a much better job of understanding sort of what's happening across the country, not just on either coast.
Yeah, and then of course another group of people that may feel like they're underreported on or not covered enough. I think you also mentioned this a little bit, but you wrote a book that's called "That's What She Said," and it talks about discrimination between men and women and vice versa, and how we can get to a better place. To end the part of the conversation on COVID, do you also feel that women have been adversely affected more so than men during this pandemic? And have we had enough attention for that?
Yes, so all the data shows, oh my gosh, women have been affected so much more adversely economically, not in terms of health outcomes, but economically. If you look in the United States, a year ago, before COVID, women had finally actually made up the majority of the workforce. We have now lost millions of women. By August, something like over 2 million women had actually dropped out altogether because of the impossible demands of handling work at home with no childcare while you're trying to either take care of young children or elderly parents, or your kids aren't in school and you have to do the schooling as well, which has fallen disproportionately on women. And then the job losses themselves have fallen way disproportionately on women. You have women are disproportionately represented in hospitality and travel industries that were hurt particularly badly. If you looked at the unemployment figures for December, they were 100% attributed to women. 100% of job losses were attributed to women. And so what it's really laid bare is the inequality we have here. It's structural inequality, it's institutionalized inequality, and it's brought it to high relief. And to answer your question, is it getting enough attention? No, absolutely not. This should be in the headlines every single day. It is such an important issue. We are the only country in the world here in the United States that doesn't have a guaranteed family leave, paid family leave, maternity leave. We don't have universal preschool. We are set up, our workplaces we're set up by men for men. Women have been trying for decades to kind of fit in and culturally fit into a culture that is really not our own. But what the pandemic laid bare is it's simply not enough. We have to be realistic. If we're going to have women in the workplace, which we need for for the economy to be healthy, then we actually have to address these underlying issues.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if this was a promotional session to migrate to America, then we're not doing a great job so far, because you pointed out a couple of really problematic and systemic inequalities. Now, we're also here, of course, because we want to learn from you how we can actually overcome some of these issues. and partially perhaps also based on your own story. So I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you about that. I mean, you've had an incredibly successful run as journalist, as reporter, as editor, now as author, as contributor. Really fantastic. And we want to know, of course, how can we replicate that? So maybe we should go back in time and ask you, when you were about the age of most of the students, I guess in your early 20s, what was your plan for life then?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate in that I knew I wanted to be a journalist early on, and I didn't realize until later how lucky I was to actually know what I wanted to be from a young age. So that was very fortunate, and I also knew, I grew up in New Jersey, and my dad used to commute to New York. And my entire life, on our driveway in the morning, there was a Wall Street Journal in our driveway in the morning, and a paper that I never, ever picked up until I was in college. And in college, I got an internship in New York City with a magazine that no longer exists called Saturday Review. And but I would commute in with my dad on the bus to New York every morning. And this was before iPhones. So I was super bored. So out of desperation, I picked up his Wall Street Journal and started reading it one day. And I was hooked, like instantly hooked, because the Wall Street Journal, certainly at that time, had these amazing front page stories that were the best written news I'd ever seen. And at the same time, all this stuff that I thought was just boring nonsense on the inside of the paper, I realized was actually almost like reading a serialized soap opera. Like every day, there are these little articles on the inside, but it would be actually following along a real compelling story about a company and the executive who was messing up, or the executive who was trying to buy another company. And it made me understand that what I thought of was boring business journalism was actually great storytelling, and it was about people. It wasn't about like faceless companies. It was about people doing things, and the writing was fantastic. And so very early on, I was very interested in working at the Wall Street Journal, and they had an internship. Yes, yeah. So that was my I spent 22 years at the Wall Street Journal. But the reason I got there, I should say, because I think this is relevant, is that there was an internship and I wanted to get that internship. And I applied for the internship in college. I was one of the finalists, which was exciting. There were 12 of us they brought in to the New York bureau to meet with the executives. And I will tell you, this was a huge life lesson. I walked in, I met these other 11 students, and they were all much more qualified than I was in my mind, right? I had worked for my local newspaper over the summer, and I had written for my college paper, but these were people who had written for Time and Newsweek and Business Week. There were people with graduate degrees, and I was an undergraduate. And it was very intimidating. And I thought that for sure I was not going to get this internship. I walked in, I was like, forget it. Like I don't have a shot. And because I didn't have a shot, I relaxed. And because I was relaxed, there was a big news story going on. It was actually the breakup of AT&T that day. There was a big news story going on. So as they're giving us a tour around the newsroom, there's all these bells ringing and people running around. And I just started asking questions. I knew nothing. And I just started asking the bureau chief who was giving us the tour, like, can you explain what's happening? And then he would say, and then I would say, well, wait a second, I don't understand. Can you explain, like, why does the judge care that they're too big, and why? And I just kept asking questions because I wanted to understand. And I was sure I didn't get the job. And it turns out I did get the internship. And later, much later, they told me the reason I got that internship above more qualified people was because I asked the questions. They said, that's what we need in a reporter. We don't need somebody who pretends to be an expert. We need somebody who's not afraid to ask the most basic questions to make sure that they absolutely understand what's happening and get to the bottom of the story. And it's a life lesson I have taken for the rest of time, and that I pass on to others.
Yeah, and you said also that that sort of points to a couple of characteristics that really help, especially in the start of your career, perhaps throughout, things like humility. You said to show curiosity, to show a certain passion for topics, and of course to listen. And these are perhaps not the first characteristics that come to mind when we think of what should we show on our CV or what should we talk about in terms of our strengths, but that effectively will help you a lot, not just in getting the job, but in getting the job done.
That's right. That's right. And one of the, when you talk about the humility and asking questions, if you look at some of the biggest scandals that have happened, business scandals in particular, like I think about Enron. I don't know if you guys are all familiar with the Enron scandals. It was a big, company. It was a really hot company that nobody really understood, but they were making a lot of money and they talked a good game. And journalists would just fall in with like, what a fabulous, they got cover stories. They were amazing. Same thing with Theranos, with Elizabeth Holmes, who ran Theranos, right? People were just gobsmacked by the way she could talk and the way that she was so charismatic and the promises she made. And as a result, people were not looking underneath to say, wait a second, I don't understand how your business works. Let's get to the bottom of it. And when a reporter finally did, it turned out that the company was a fraud. Same thing with Enron.
Yeah.
And that was a result of people really not, of people being too embarrassed to say, wait a second, reporters, I should say, journalists, being too cowed to say, I don't understand. Please explain.
Yeah. Now, of course, we live today in an economy and in a society where people are outspoken, where they build personal brands from a very early age. An influencer economy, an opinion economy, you could say. To what extent do you think it is still good to have those qualities that you talk about that are perhaps a little bit the antidote or the opposite of what you should show if you want to make it as an influencer, I suppose?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you brought that up, Peter, because, we hear people at the beginning of their career talk about their brands. There was a young journalist who someone asked me to go take her to coffee not long ago. And we sat down and the first thing she said is like, I'm really concerned about my brand and building my brand. That's kind of ass backwards, if you excuse the expression. And it's of concern. What we need to understand is what you want to be known for are your values and your conscientiousness and the work that you're doing and the results that you're getting. And the brand comes from that, not the other way around. And my concern is I have to say, I'm very impressed by the influencers who I see, the young people who are getting out there, and there's probably some in this class, people who are really, really great at showing a lifestyle or showing a point of view, which I think is fantastic. But I guess the question that I have is how long does that last? I have some, we don't know yet, because being an influencer is still sort of a new career path. So we haven't actually seen how that plays out. I don't know if there is a lasting career that can last you decades from being an influencer, or is being an influencer a little bit more like being a child star, where you've got a shelf life and then you're done, right? And then you really need to have other skills to fall back on.
Yeah, and obviously you're a good example of somebody whose career lasts and success comes over time and with experience and building that up. Now, of course, at some point, if you want to get ahead in your career in the company, then I suppose you do have to go a little bit from, sort of asking questions and showing humility to having confidence and putting yourself forth. I mean, that's what we're seeing very often. And especially also in the comparison, I think, between men and women, that men perhaps get often more promoted because they, rightly or wrongly, boast about their achievements and their accomplishments. Is that something that you've experienced? Is there another track towards success? And what can you tell us about that?
Sure. And you're 100% right. This is a really tricky situation for women in particular. There's a lot of research behind this that shows that men who talk about their own achievements, we think better of them. When women do the same, we penalize them. We say they're pushy and abrasive and obnoxious, and it hurts their careers. And there's men who talk more than women. We say that they're smarter. when women talk more, we think less of them. We think they have lower leadership qualities, that they are less effective. So there's this double standard that really, really goes against women. So there's a couple things here that I think that we can do that are antidotes. I mean, one is something that leadership needs to do, and I talk to a lot of leaders in business, and I feel very, very, very strongly that is up to us as leaders to understand the dynamics there. And in fact, while I was reporting my book, at the same time running USA Today, I actually changed my own leadership strategy by making sure that I walked out into the newsroom and I would actually like pluck out people who were quiet, like women, pregnant women, people of color, people who I thought were doing a good job but weren't putting their hands up to get a promotion. And I would just I'd bring people into my office every once in a while and say, hey, you know what, there's this job open. You'd be a good candidate. I can't tell you would get it, but you would be a great candidate. You didn't put your hand up. And either encourage them, you can put your hand up, or if they weren't interested, I'd say that's fine, but why don't we talk about what you are interested in, and let's talk a little bit about your career path. So I think that leadership has to do something. Those of us who are not in leadership can also do something by listening for, being aware of the person who's being overlooked in the meeting, the person who's being interrupted. Women are interrupted 3 times more frequently than men, and calling it out. So, you know, if Susan gets cut off in a meeting, anyone in that meeting should listen for it and say, wait a second, Susan was speaking. I'd love to hear her finish. There's things that we can do to interrupt that cycle.
Yeah, and I of course I'm very self-aware now to make sure I don't interrupt you too much during this conversation.
It's okay.
Now, you know, you did mention also a couple of other things. I mean, so you're talking about the importance of having the right mentors, having the right managers and leaders that help you through this. Now, of course, you know, that's if you have positive examples. You also talked to me about some cases where you had to deal with like negative examples. Like, for example, you said at some point people called you in a bad way, like a newspaper girl, or you said that you could not count the times that your sources for your stories hit on you. I mean, like, it's a horrible thing. And also that, you know, you've seen perhaps people around you, although that hasn't been your case, you told me, that got what you call mommy tracked in their careers, which basically meant that about their, you know, 30, 35, when they're about to make a lot of progress, that in fact, they get sidetracked and sort of almost punished for being a woman and a mother. So when we experience these kinds of discriminations, and you mentioned all of these examples, what do you do in that case to get ahead?
Sure.
And, yeah.
So yes, pretty much everything that I've mentioned in the book, like everything that can happen to women has happened to me. And every mistake you can make, I have made myself. But I've learned from it. So, you know, one of the things on the leadership side, what people can do as leaders, I think is really important. In my own case, I had my kids, I had them 2 years apart. I was pretty young. I was at the Wall Street Journal, and I had 2 babies at home, and my boss offered me a raise, and I said, no, I just can't handle it. I like the job I'm in. Most people at that point in their careers, they are written off, they are mommy tracked, and they don't get the opportunity, and they fall right off the career track. The difference in my case is a great boss who 6 months later came to me and said, hey, we've got this other opportunity. Are you interested? And I said no again. And this went on for 5 years until my younger child was in kindergarten. And at that point, my boss came to me again and said, hey, we want to create a brand new 4th section, but we don't know what it's going to be. Do you want to run it and invent a whole new 4th section? And I was like, hell yes, I do. I am so ready. And that led to me creating Weekend Journal for the Wall Street Journal. And that in turn led to every other opportunity I have had since then, because it was a big success. And then that raised my profile and allowed me to go and do everything else I've ever done. But the key there is most women would not have had that opportunity. If I had been somewhere else or had a different boss, I would not be here with you today. I would have been mommy tracked, and my career probably would have frittered out like so many other women who I know who are as talented and as smart or more than I am, who fell off the track. So really important for the leader to do that. But I would also say from the point of view of the woman who's being overlooked, don't let yourself be mommy tracked. I think that it is important to say, you know, maybe this isn't right. Maybe I don't want to be transferred right now. I can't do that right now, but don't take me off the list. Like, I really do want to continue. But again, I think most of the literature right now, it's about women leaning in, like we have to put our hands up and make sure we have a seat at the table. I think that's only half the answer. That's half or less, because if the men and the leaders are not leaning back in toward us, we can't do it on our own. So we need both parts of that equation.
Yeah, and you really put a big emphasis on that, don't you, in your book, where you sort of say, and it's also the subtitle of your book, what men need to know and women need to tell them about working together. And so you really see this as sort of an alliance that's necessary to be built. Joanne, I want to ask one final question about your career, and then I want to bring in the students that will be asking a lot of questions as well. So this final question is, you know, during this pandemic, you said, you know, you also start to think, I mean, we've all had our projects during the pandemic as we were locked at home. I suppose you must have been playing some piano, I guess. But one project that you mentioned beyond that was that you work on this idea of reinvention. I suppose, you know, personal reinvention, but also professional reinvention. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, and perhaps also when you think that's appropriate to do, you know, in your career? Also, perhaps, can you do it at 25? Can you do it at 35? And how do you do that?
Yes. So it's been fascinating. I've been doing all of this research. I've done a lot of work with social scientists who study different kinds of reinvention. And what I have found, if you look at people who study creativity, researchers who study trauma survivors and how do they come out of it, and then if you look at people who study career reinvention, and what I found is there's a commonality in the process that anybody goes through for any of these types. Different, they sound very different, but they follow the same process. And part of the process, it's called different things in different, some people call it the liminal period, some people call it the in-between period, some people call it the incubation period, but whatever it is, it's a period of time where you are kind of lost. And so many people felt that way during this lockdown, and it gave them an opportunity, and maybe an uncomfortable feeling, but an opportunity to think about, what are my priorities, and am I doing what I really love to do? Am I living where I want to live? Are my relationships the way I want them to be? And you need that, it turns out, in order to have what comes next, which is considered the breakthrough, when you have the great idea, or you have the aha moment. And what's fascinating is so many people have gone through that, and it doesn't matter what age you are. My kids are now millennials, and I have my daughter she has completely pivoted in her own career. She's in her 20s. She pivoted in her career in a really, really positive direction, because and she moved. She and her now, she's a newlywed. She and her husband even move locations. And I think it's all for the positive, because it really made them think, both of them, about how do we want to live out our lives. And so I've seen it with older people, and I've seen it with millennials. And I think it's uncomfortable. I will tell you, it is not fun, but it's really important, and it really gets you to the other side.
Yeah, and you know, it's also perhaps a positive note to end this first part of the conversation on that, you know, because I see her in the comments from Asuman, for example. She says, you know, this was a terrible time, very sad time for so many people. I mean, so many people lost their lives, so many people lost somebody they loved. You know, many people get very sick. But for all of the other of us, it hasn't been an easy time either. But I guess the positive message there is that, you know, it can be uncomfortable also to go through a transition in your career or in your life during this pandemic times, but it can be worthwhile to do that, and you may come out better on the other side. So I'm gonna remember that lesson. Now, Joanne, I wanna turn now to students that are here with us, and the first one that I want you to meet is Shadi. Shadi is from Germany, but in Barcelona. I think she's lucky there. She already told us the weather's great, and actually the bars are open. So Shadi, you're lucky, and also we thank you for being here with us while we're all locked up at home. But why don't you go ahead and ask Joanne your question and take your time, I would say. We want to have a little bit of a conversation.
It's perfect. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful being a part of this. It's really interesting, and thank you really much. So my question is, what was the most surprising or the most surprising things you have learned when you were writing your books, especially in the case of That's What She Said?
Oh, thank you. So many surprising things. I would say that, oh, if I had to pick out, well, I think probably in the original reporting of the book, the most surprising thing was there were so many things that happened that I thought were only happened to me. And it turns out there's a big body of research that shows that it actually happens to all women. And I think that was the biggest lesson, and the thing that actually, it was both alarming and at the same time made me feel less alone. There were a lot of things that I thought were my fault. And I realized that actually this is something that happens to all women. For instance, when I first became an editor, in my first job as an editor, I had a guy who was one of my direct reports who just didn't do his job. And when I would say, hey, you were supposed to do X, he would say, well, you do it. Like he had zero respect for me and wouldn't actually listen to me. So I went to my own boss, a man, and I said, there's something wrong with the way I'm managing. Like, I don't understand. This guy is, I said to my boss, what do you do when people don't listen to you? And he looked really confused. And he said, well, that's never happened. And I assumed that was my problem as a manager. I realized later in the research that this is very common, that if you put a man and a woman in the same job, the woman doesn't get the same level of respect as the man does. And she is not seen as important as the man is in the same job.
Okay, yeah, thank you. But how did you really overcome it? Like maybe this specific problem, were you able to overcome this problem with this man?
Well, once I understood that there's a gender dynamic going on here, it actually helped me to understand how to manage the situation. But it also made me understand that sometimes a guy needs to be fired, which is what happened in that situation. You have to have a team where everybody is rowing in the same direction. And I got really good advice from another editor, sort of an old codger guy, but it was very good advice. He said, when you become a leader, he said, the people on your team, they're either pushing you forward or they're pulling you back. And you want all the people who are pushing you forward. Yeah.
And it's good to see that, or to hear that has been resolved in that particular case. I want to bring also the question from Ana from Mexico, who says, we are seeing nowadays, I mean, in part, thanks to your book and your work, more attention to these kinds of issues of sexism in the workplace. And so she's asking, do you see any change nowadays more broadly in society, and I suppose in the workplace, perhaps a positive change in how men relate to women at work?
Yes, absolutely. I've seen a very positive change, which I think is encouraging. So I wrote the book with men in mind, men as an audience in mind. And until COVID hit, I was actually on the road almost constantly, working with companies that really are trying to move the ball forward. And the response has been really positive. One of the most encouraging, right before lockdown, one of the talks that I gave was at an oil company in Texas, one of the most macho industries and one of the most macho states and the macho companies that you can possibly imagine. And it was an audience of about 700 or 800 men. And they weren't even all executives. Like some of these are like oil rig guys. And it was what I would call a lean forward audience. This was an audience of men who just wanted to be part of the solution. I don't think you would have seen that even 5 years ago. So the fact that we have this greater awareness and that more men are interested in helping, I think is great. I think where the problem is, where there's so much work to be done, is the men who are reading my book are going to be men who are already oriented toward wanting to do better. The men who are sort of the Cro-Magnon guys who are trying to keep the women in their place are simply not, they're not going to read the book, but they're also not going to be converted. And I think that the way that our country and the world, even, we've seen this polarization. Both poles are digging in further, but the people who are the conspiracy theorists and the anti-vaxxers and the misogynists and the racists are digging in further, and I think that's of concern.
Yeah, well, I hope there will be more men and women that will be reading your book. I'll make a short commercial break and again remind people it's That's What She Said. I have it here on my phone, actually. I've read it on Kindle. It's a great experience too. Now, Joanne, I have to say, I did a DNA test and it turns out I have more Neanderthal DNA in my blood than most people. So I'm afraid I fit both of your profiles. I'm both a Cro-Magnon guy and a reader of your book. Anyway, well, let's turn to the next student with some questions. I want to turn to, if I may, to Charlotte. I know I'm reversing order a little bit here. Charlotte, who's studying in Barcelona, but who's joining us actually from sunny southern France. And she has a question, I think, about women in international organizations, sports organizations. Charlotte?
Yes, I do. Hello, it's lovely to be here. It's nice to meet you, and it's nice to hear your story. Yes, I'm doing a sport management bachelor, so I'm quite involved into the sport aspect of women in business. And my question goes so far: it's since their founding of the International Olympic Committee, nor FIFA, they haven't appointed a woman as chairman or in a top senior position. And do you think this will just happen soon, or will it still take many years? And do you think it's because no one feels that she can take on this role?
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. This is such a good question. So here's the issue with sports management. If you look at FIFA, if you look at the Olympic Committee, the problem, as I see it, is actually not just getting a woman to lead the organization. It is actually the entire organization that goes right into the, on the ground in the various countries. While I was at Gannett, I was not only editor-in-chief of USA Today, I was the chief content officer. So I was overseeing 110 newspapers owned by Gannett, including the Indy Star in Indiana. And I was very involved in an investigation that they did that actually revealed the sexual abuse that went on in USA Gymnastics. That was a massive sexual abuse scandal. And at that time, when we were doing that, I said, you know what, there's so many of these youth sports. This cannot just be a USA Gymnastics issue. It's probably happening in other sports, which we have since heard that indeed that is the case. And it shows you that this is sort of infiltrates from the top down, but it's not going to be solved by putting a woman in charge. I mean, we've seen in Tokyo, there was another executive, I don't know if you saw that resigned yesterday for saying something horrendous about women. You had the head of the Tokyo committee who had to resign after saying women talk too much. So that's horrendous, but it's reflective of everything that's going on throughout. And by the way, one other element that's really, really important here is we need to keep the focus on this. And this goes back to news coverage. If you look at what is the demographic makeup of newsrooms and newsroom leadership, it is overwhelmingly male. And if you look at who's covering sports, it's even more overwhelmingly male. So at USA Today, there's a wonderful columnist named Christine Brennan. She was pretty much the only one who was writing consistently about the discrimination in pay, the disparity in pay between women and men's soccer in the United States, with a great women's team and a terrible men's team, and the men still got paid more. So we really have to actually have this is a societal issue more so than just putting a woman at the top.
Very well. Charlie, if you have a follow-up question, we can always bring you back in. Perhaps we can turn now to Niga. She's from Azerbaijan, and I think, Niga, you are also in Baku, joining us from Azerbaijan. And we're curious to hear your questions for Joanne.
Hi, thank you so much for this interesting conversation. It's been really, really interesting to hear about your experience. My question is, as we know, right now, corporate social responsibility is so important to businesses, but sometimes CSR funding overlooks objectives like women empowerment. What do you think could be the steps that companies can take in order to really focus on gender issues and also integrate gender issues into their CSR strategies on a more systematic basis?
Right. Another excellent question. You guys are good. In terms of approaching gender discrimination, particularly in a corporate level, it's really got to, first of all, has to start from the top, has to start from the leadership, as I keep saying. But I do think that we are underutilizing data. So if you think about how companies work, they employ data for absolutely everything. There are targets for your revenue and for your profitability and for your margins and for pretty much absolutely every single thing, for your sales. We have more data now available to us than ever before in history. We need to be keeping track of that data when it comes to gender equality, and that actually would solve a lot of ills. So, for example, in a company, if you look at your entry level and it's 50-50 male-female, you need to track what's going on at every level on the way up, right? So if you're losing women from one level to the next, which almost everybody does. Lean-In and McKinsey did this research and found at the first step of promotion, for every 100 men promoted, only 70 women are. If that's happening, it's not the women's fault, it's your fault, the company, right? And so you need to then address, you can catch these things early. We could solve a lot of these problems in a relatively short period of time. If you think about getting women into leadership, think about how long does it take to go from a junior employee to a senior employee? Well, if you're in a law firm, or if you're in a managing consulting firm, it can be as like maybe 7 years, right? Which a long time in somebody's career, but not in the big picture. It is not a long time. And so companies, organizations that want to get back to gender equity, start with your entry level, keep track of that data all the way up, and we could fix this problem pretty soon.
Yeah. We often say what gets measured gets managed.
Yeah.
It seems like that's also the case here. We can come back to you also, Niga. We did get a few questions in from the chat also, two quite similar questions, I think. One from Gabriela in Poland. Actually, she's in Dublin right now, but she's from Poland, and one from Trang Do, who's from Vietnam. And they're both asking questions a little bit more on the personal level, Joanne. They're saying, for example, if you were meeting your 20-year-old you today, what advice would you give her? And similarly, Gabriela is asking, what would be the golden advice that you have for us as we're sort of starting to make our way in life?
Sure. If I were to look back on my 20-year-old self, I do think the number one piece of advice I would give myself is to exhale, to not be so fraught. There are a lot of pathways to success, and there's also, you want to be open to new experiences that might come your way, that might take you in a different direction than you ever imagined, and you want to be open to that. And I think at my 20-year-old self, where I was like staying up all night and studying for exams and worrying about my future, and and then thinking I'm never going to be able to support myself, and things tend to work out, I think. But I also do think, though, that being open to different pathways than you might have envisioned is good advice. My very first book, you see the piano in the background, my very first book was actually about music. And I only wrote it, I had a great music teacher as a kid, and I had this incredible experience when this guy unfortunately died. And it was almost accidental that I ended up writing about this music teacher, which in a story that went viral that led to me writing a book about music. You just have to be sort of open. That's not something I ever planned on.
Right. So we'll bear that in mind. I do want to ask you at the end of the conversation, I want a little bit more about that piano. I mean, like we've been looking at it and now we've been revealing a little bit. But before we do, perhaps we can bring in Carolina, who's from Mexico, and who is in Munich right now in Germany. Carolina, you have a question as well for Joanne, right?
Yeah, I'm really grateful for being here, and it's a pleasure to meet you. So my question is, there's a point where you question what you were doing is right or not for yourself and your career, and how do you overcome this situation?
Yeah, I think everybody has that point where they question themselves and like, am I doing the right thing? Should I move? Should I do something different? I think that during COVID, that has been a particular issue. I do think that, when you're particularly the stage where all of you guys are now, you're in a good position to say, here's something I want to try. And if it doesn't work, you can pivot. I have a college roommate who was an economics major who at the age of 30 decided she actually really loved medicine. And now she's a neurologist. Like she went back to medical school. She had to take all of her pre-med courses as a 30-year-old and went to med school. And she loves her career. I would also say, I do think it's important. I know it's a cliche, but I really do think it's important to follow your passions as opposed to what other people think you should do. Do what you want to do. And sometimes it's hard to figure out which one is which. I had another roommate who was genius, valedictorian of everything, went into business because that's what you're supposed to do, got the highest paying Wall Street job because that's what you're supposed to do, and ended up just hating it. When she went to Stanford Business School, she went to Yale and Stanford Business School, super brilliant, and hated it, was great at it and hated it. And she ended up with a mental health crisis. And when she came out of it, she quit her job and became a screenwriter, which is what she should have been from in the beginning. Like she loved soap operas as and she loved science fiction. That's how she should have started her career. So I think that that was somebody who was so rigidly pushed into doing something that really didn't feel right to her. So I do think there is something to be said about, don't worry. Like when I went into journalism, I was sure I would starve for the rest of my life. And I didn't. I mean, go into what you really care about. And I think that's always good advice.
Excellent. In a similar vein, Joanne Trang from Vietnam, she also asked, I suppose this is the other side of the same coin. She also said, if you look back at your life and to your 20-year-old self, and I suppose the whole road you traveled since, she said, is there anything that, you say you regret and that perhaps us, by knowing it a little bit earlier, that we might be able not to make such a mistake or have that regret?
Yeah, okay. So here's the thing. I have made a million mistakes. I have done things that have been stupid. I have done things that have not worked. I have so many things that I have learned from. Would I change it? No, actually, no, I would not. I think that every single mistake, every single painful thing that I have gone through, I've come out learning something from it. And I guess that would be the advice I would give you is it doesn't really help us to sort of go back and think about, oh my gosh, I should have done this, I should have done that. It's not helpful because we're not going to change the past. But what is helpful is to say, okay, what have I learned? What can I take out of that? What do I want to do differently next time? Because here's the thing, you will make mistakes and you will do things that don't work. And you will do things that you say, oh my God, how could I have done that? It doesn't, it's just, there's no upside in wallowing in regret. And the fact is that the person you become that way at least as much because of the failures as because of the successes.
Right. I do suppose but I want to make it sure that it's explicit. I mean, I do suppose that maybe then you're one of the people who doesn't have regrets, because at least when it came to ethical decisions, you know, or these kinds of things that might really give you regret, that there you did follow a moral compass, or am I wrong?
Oh my gosh,
that.
yes. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes, have a moral compass, be ethical. That would be a regret that you couldn't get over, honestly. But yes, I've always felt like I've always attempted to do the right thing. Don't cheat, don't, be kind to others. But really, you have to absolutely be ethical. I mean, look, one of the things that, one of the harshest failures I've had is I ran a magazine that after the financial crisis, it failed, and it put me out of work and everybody else who worked there. And I remember I came home that night afterward, and my kids are like, well, how come you're not like crying and falling apart? And I said, this is incredibly sad, but I know that my team and myself, like every person in that organization, we put 150% of ourselves into that organization. And we did absolutely, we didn't leave anything on the floor there. I mean, we put it all in, and
then you don't have regrets.
Right.
You know, maybe a final question from one of the people who's following is Marcella. Marcella, she's asking, and I assume that she may live in a different culture as one in the US, but she's basically asking, do you see changes in the role that the women have in leadership according to cultures? I mean, does that play a role? And I suppose perhaps a follow-up question would be, what do you do? Do you try to change the culture, or do you move away to another culture?
Yeah, so the role of women in different cultures is clearly different. I mean, I was speaking yesterday to a journalist in Japan, where they have a much harder time getting women into management even than they do here in the United States. So there's clearly, and then if you go to Iceland, where I spent time in Iceland for my book, women are doing way better. They're running the country. They're running the biggest banks. So there is a variety of ways. I think that, one thing we didn't touch on that I think is really important, regardless of the culture you're in, is every one of us, man and woman, whatever gender, really needs to be aware of the issues that women or underrepresented people, like people of color, are facing. And every one of us needs to be a change agent. And every one of us can do that, even at a very junior level, by just being aware of any of the discrimination that we see. So like I said, if a woman's being interrupted in a meeting, anybody should feel like they can call it out. In my book, I talk about a strategy called brag buddies that I love, which women can do with each other, or a man can do with a woman, which is because women are penalized for talking about their own achievements. There were these women in a consulting firm, and they came up with this strategy where one woman would tell the other woman her achievements and vice versa. And then each woman would go and basically brag about the other one. Which was much more effective in helping them, raise their profile and get noticed for their accomplishments. There are so many of these strategies that we can do at any level, starting at even an entry level, to help raise up those who are being overlooked. And by doing that ourselves, I think that comes back to you, right? It's a virtuous circle. You help others, they help you. And we all need to do it, men and women.
Yeah, and I think that you're already inspiring people, because I see here a comment from Anna in the chat. She says, that's just what I needed to hear at this point, starting my career. We are coming to an end now, Joanne. It's sad, but it is true. So I will once more tell people that they should read your book. Again, we have 100 copies that we've purchased for those people that were here today. It's the book is called That's What She Said. I'm showing it again on the phone. And now, before we end, Joanne, we want to know what's up with the piano. Are you, do you have a missed calling as a professional pianist, or what's the story?
I'm actually a terrible pianist, but as a kid, I was a very serious musician on the viola. I am a pianist. I'm just a bad one, but I was a good violist. And I one of the most important things in my life, again, was music. I never wanted to pursue it professionally. And as I said, I wrote this book about music. And the reason I wrote the book is because I realized that my music teacher had such a huge impact on my life in terms of things like focus and conscientiousness and attention to detail and practice, 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 and especially learning to pick yourself up when you fail, because you fail a lot when you audition for things. And the book really is, that first book, Strings Attached, really is about the importance of that person in your life who really pushes you to go forward, and the person who you probably don't realize helped you. Very often it's a teacher from your past or your present, perhaps. But the piano is there because I have to have a piano wherever I am, and because as a good mother, I forced my children to take music lessons, of course.
That's amazing. And I see that they must be following you, because we can see there also the attributes of various instruments. So maybe we got the wrong book. I mean, I'm seeing here Strings Attached, the real bestseller of Joanne, and certainly a passion. No, we're going to stick with That's What She Said for today. Joanne, thank you so much for being with us. It's been an absolute joy. I mean, I think we all enjoyed this. We learned so much from you. And of course, we hope that next time when we learn from you, that we can do so also in person. You're always welcome here in Europe. And now that you're vaccinated, I suppose that's also safe again. So thanks so much for being with us. And then I think I'm going to hand it over back to Luc on the other side of the lake. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation. Your questions are great. And next time, yes, in person, I will be very happy to come to Geneva or south of France or wherever you happen to be meeting next time.
That's stuck clearly. Look.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lipman. And yes, you will always be welcomed on one of our campuses in Europe. We'll also help you to spread your book around in Europe to our students and help you pass on the message. That will be our mission for the next weeks to come.
Thank you.
Yes, we're really looking forward to that, and I think it has been an inspiring message to our students. You have given a lot of hope to most of them, to all the listeners, and you have really this sense of optimism that is really crucial and important nowadays. So great session from Learning from Leaders. We will be back soon on April 15th already with Johnny Harris, the founder of Bright Trip. He's also a filmmaker. He's a digital influencer. He has over 900,000 followers on his YouTube channel. So that's the next speaker we will have. In the meantime, stay safe, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you back on April 15th. Bye-bye. Have a nice evening.